Good evening, astrology fans. We're talking Saturn return here. I haven't really talked much about Saturn return, but it's probably going to be one of my favorite topics. Uh, yeah, it's gonna be one of my favorite topics. I was thinking a lot about it the past couple of days, and then I had somebody I was talking to who's going through their Saturn return right now, and they brought it up. So I'm also going to read from this book here. There's a little section on the Saturn return. And the first sentence here, major part of Saturn returns to me is the maturation factor. So we're talking about somewhere around 28, 29, 30 years old. And I might go deep with this because I don't really know exactly what's going on, but there's something definitely going on when it comes to the Saturn return. So what I mean by that is you get around that age when the Saturn makes a return, you're 28, 29. It's usually, if you haven't prepared for it, it can be a really rough time because you have to grow up. If you haven't prepared for it, you have to grow up fast. So he uses the example in this book that the author or the creator of evolutionary astrology, Jeffrey Wolf Green, at 24 started studying astrology, and then he was giving free readings. And by the time he hit 30, he was prepared to be an astrologer. Uh, and before 24, I think he rejected astrology, or it took him a little bit of time, but you can see the timing there where it was like it kind of would blend right into 30, and then he becomes an astrologer. There's not that much resistance, there's not that much maturation process, versus, let's say, someone who, because I was thinking about this, a lot of people go through high school and college and never even work a job. So let's take that for an example. Person goes to college 4 years, and then let's say they go to law school for 3 years. So or graduate school. So that's 2 or 3 years. So we're looking at 7 years. They're 25, 26 years old, and getting close to that 28-year mark. Or maybe they took a year off. So a lot of people will be right around 26, 27, and then now they have to work. And it's not what they thought it was going to be because they never worked before. Because I would tell you a little bit about myself and the experience that I had, because I think a lot of people feel this way. Uh, when you hit the Saturn return and you have to start working, it is like you get into that cycle at 9 to 5, and you're not making that much money. There's a lot going on with it, and it can hit a person really, really hard. So take that person who didn't really realize what the work life was going to be like. Uh, it's going to hit them hard, and they have a hard decision to make. They can embrace it and just go with it. They can refuse it, and either way, it's going to get bad. They can refuse to. If you don't embrace it, it's going to get bad, regardless. Is what it seems like. So yeah, so a lot of people, it's not just really about embracing work. A lot of people have they know what they want to do, and it fits which I'm going to get into. It fits their life path. So take Jeffrey Green, for example. He would say the astrology thing really fit his life path. It was something that was necessary for him. It was on time. Hits a Saturn return, and it fits. And then he goes on to be a world famous astrologer, or you just say goes on to become a professional astrologer for the next 30 years. Welcome in. I'm talking about the Saturn return and the maturation process of the Saturn return. Now, a lot of people, I think, they let's take for example the people that aren't prepared for what's to come. Most people work a regular job. So Saturn return hits, you start working, and it's not what it seems like. It's not what it appears like. And now, what do you do? Well, most people just do it. They just go through the motions. They don't change. They work their job, and they go on like that. And they adapt. And then there's others that refuse. Uh, they kind of like partially resist. And I think part of the maturation process, at least in my culture, I'm assuming most people watching this are from the United States or a culture similar to the United States. When you hit your Saturn return and you start working a 9 to 5, or let's say you've been working a 9 to 5, but you had like a lot of friends, etc. But like, go back to you hit your Saturn return, you have your 9 to 5, and your friends start getting married or your friends start moving. That's when I think this is also not really mentioned. There's a pressure. There's that pressure to not just mature in the sense that you have to work this job, but you have to almost get married. There's huge pressure to get married because, and this is what I dealt with for my Saturn return. I remember I was 20, just graduated college. I was 20, it was before my Saturn return. I was like 27, moved to the city, moved to my hometown city, got an apartment by myself, and I got a couple of things. I got my first paycheck. I was used to making like in the past when I was younger, I'd make like 800 to 1,000 a week working the job I had right at it, or during high school, right out of high school. I got my first paycheck at my government job, and I was making it was like 450 a week. And I looked at my paycheck, I looked at where I was living, I was like, fuck this. This is ridiculous. I can't live here. 450 a week? And it didn't really cross my mind to like start a business or work a second job. It was just that's all I could think about because I was living in a dump. And I wanted to be in the city though, because that's where, I didn't have any friends. That's where I could meet people. It was more lively. And yeah, I quit that job for not just for that reason, but I quit it for other reasons. And then shit got bad. That's when shit started to get bad. And that was an example of me resisting my Saturn. I'd say me resisting my Saturn return. And see, I just didn't understand reality. I didn't really understand a lot of things at that age. And I think a lot of people don't have the full picture at their Saturn return. And it's almost impossible to have the full picture. Like what I'd say now is I have a much fuller picture about how life works, about how the system works, and things like that. Back then, I didn't have any real concept for any of this. I just thought I could do whatever I wanted. And so back to this idea of, having to get married, etc. If I had at that time, if I had a significant other, even if it was just a girlfriend and I was living with, I'm not sure I would have quit that job. Because number one, that paycheck would have looked a lot better. And number two, we probably wouldn't have been living in that apartment. I probably would have had a better apartment. And the third thing is every night you got someone that come home to more specifically to hang out with. Because all my friends were gone. All my friends had moved away. All my close friends had moved away. Some of them that were here were doing things I wasn't interested in. And I didn't like to have roommates. So in the next several years, I went through more of this process, and I tried to work it out with things like roommates and different jobs. And I was really just making it more difficult for myself. Now, I think that many people who go through their Saturn return might have an easier time if they do have that significant other. So there's many people. I do think that this is true. There's many people out there that go through their Saturn return, and if you talk to them about this maturation process, it's not that bad. A lot of them think that this is just the way it is, so they expected it to be this way. I give it thinking of another example. I have a friend who's a little bit like she's like 10 years older. She graduated school, got her job, which she still has today, same job as a scientist, was married at 27, and if you asked her about her Saturn return, she doesn't know anything about astrology, but she would have nothing to say about it. Absolutely nothing to say. It was just par for the course. That's just what you do. But in her case, she always had her significant other from day one that she married, that she's still married to today. And you could just go through the list of people. 50% of the population at least have the same experience as her. No problems. It's just what people do. Where you have someone like me who couldn't just go out there and meet somebody. It just wasn't going to work like that. I mean, there were some opportunities but nothing was working in my favor. So I had to go through that alone process. I had to go through that maturation process in a much more difficult scenario than these other people. So I don't really blame. I sure would like to get more deeper into this process. I don't really blame myself or other people who go through this and have a hard time because one, they don't have the nut. Like I said, they don't have the full picture, and two, they don't have a very good. They're usually not in a very good situation to begin with. It's out of their control. And the third thing is, which is what I would kind of faced up against, was this isn't life. Like, how can you people live like this when you go to these jobs and see when you go to a lot of these workplaces, when you get in these environments, it's like a shock the way these people operate. And see, I had worked when I said I made $800 to $1,000 as a teenager. Um, I was working at a pizzeria that I was pretty much running, and the people that I was working with were the coolest people on planet Earth. And there was responsibility, but it wasn't the same as this boring office or this boring world called government. And really, when I say, you could say office, government, the government, essentially what I mean by that is it was a government job, but it's the system and it starts there. The system starts with the rules and regulations. It branches out from there. So no matter really where you work, if you're part of it's part of the system for the most part, whether it's corporate, if it's any type of like 9 to 5 job, if it's a company, etc. It's all the same. It's all the same. The people all act mostly the same. It goes into this when we get into this book, we're talking about the consensus. That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about consensus consciousness. And I didn't exist. I didn't belong in consensus consciousness. So that was the third thing I mentioned there, that if you're going through your Saturn return, that can cause major problems if you are preparing yourself to operate in the consensus and you get there and then you realize, you start to see what the consensus is. Because before that, you really didn't know what it was. You thought it was, for example, if you wanted to be a lawyer, or in my case, I had a criminal justice degree. I was working for the Department of Transportation. That was the first job that I got. When you get there, then you start to realize that you're not. That's the only way you can really. Well, that's not just the only way, but in my case, that's when I really started to realize I don't belong here. And I just spent 4 years going through this degree, and it's very very difficult. So it gets into that. We'll read a little bit here. It says here. Let's go to. So I said the Saturn return to me is a maturation process. The Saturn return naturally divides a lifetime into segments. Saturn also represents time itself, and maturation is a timing process. The first is childhood and the transition into adulthood. The second is the transition from adulthood to what we call elderhood, if the person has been paying attention. The focus becomes more reflective inward, tying all the pieces of a lifetime together, the start of a winding down process. A desire to give something back all all one has received is common. So that would be, I think that would be like an example too, like these people, this consensus people that I'm talking about with my friend who just kind of had a more smooth transition. You could see her and her husband, if everything continues as planned, when she gets older, she probably will be in a position to give back, like in the next 10, 20 years. She'll start that process of really giving, wanting to give back more so than she has already because she's accumulated so much. Usually, these people accumulate a lot of resources. Some make it to the third Saturn return. Focus increasingly moves to planning the next lifetime, and that's interesting. I'm not going to get into that. As always, the great majority of us have a lot of resistance to these natural transitions. See, I would say in my case, I wasn't really resisting adulthood. And that's where it gets tricky when we get out of the consensus phase or consensus consciousness. Some people I do think are rejecting or resisting adulthood, but from my eyes, I was looking at my situation like this is not like this kind of getting stuck there, like looking at it like this is not even possible. I'm not even going to survive. Not like I'm not going to show up to work tomorrow. I just can't. I'm not going to because of the situation. And to me, that's different from someone saying, "Well, I don't want to go to work either. I just make myself." It's different. My situation, I would say, it's not. It's not the same. And there's people out there that are in that situation, and the situation isn't really being talked about. So it's being ignored. Now, I do think I'm thinking of another example of people who will. Uh, I think the marriage piece, I think, is important to mention. I think there's a lot of people out there that are willing to, uh, from a financial standpoint, like a survival standpoint, they're willing to push through and show up to work and not resist that part. They'll get through it. But then emotionally, they're not willing to give in and find a partner. It's when they actually can find a partner. They're being picky, they're being choosy, but they're also emotionally suffering at the same time. Maybe they're taking meds for, not that taking meds is wrong or it depends on the situation, but they're doing things to emotionally cope when all they need to do is just give in and take the best partner that they can get within a year or two, right around that 30, 31, 32, 33. And we see people do this all the time. They're not resisting that aspect of it. There's people that are ignoring the emotional component of it. And anyone who says that that's not really going on, I just look at the consensus. I look at this 50 to 70% of people, and every single one of them are doing that. They're all in partnerships. And I would argue, looking at their life, knowing a lot of these people, they wouldn't have made it. They would not have been successful without their partner. They just emotionally wouldn't be able to do it. They'd be just like the other people that have drug problems, alcohol problems, et cetera, et cetera, just to get through their that maturation process. Similarly, for then he gets into midlife crisis, which I'm not going to get into. Then he's talking about most souls do not make choices early in their life that reflect their core intentions for the life being lived. This is why the first Saturn return for most can be such a difficult time because many souls begin to realize that their life to date, the choices made, have not been in accordance with the underlying intentions for the current life. And I think that also happened to me. See, I have a lot of Mars and Pluto in my chart, which I think I decided on a criminal justice degree my second year in college. And that correlates with criminal justice. And that's probably where that came from. And a lot of like weird ideas about what I thought I could do in criminal justice, which I soon found out was definitely not for me. And that's what he's saying here, that we make choices earlier in life that don't go along with our path. And like here I am teaching astrology. Here I am on YouTube talking about astrology 10 years later. So we go from police officer, criminal justice system, to teaching astrology. So how does that, that's a huge difference. And I also was a tennis coach. So right after that, so what happened on my Saturn return is I became a tennis coach. And I had to go real fast. I had to work real fast to take all that work I had done and try to make this work so that I could live. And I think for me, when he's talking about the choices haven't been in accordance with the underlying intentions, the underlying intentions for me is that if you look at my chart, is the ninth house piece. It's the teaching, which you see as a tennis coach. You can see as a tennis coach, teaching, which we see with astrology, philosophy. I've also done some sales. Mostly after I learned about astrology, I started to see. I think maybe a lot of things in my chart could correlate with sales. Uh, so this is a lot different from what I had thought when I was young, from up until that 30-year-old period. So I was essentially setting myself up for failure. I was setting myself up for crisis. And looking back now, I mean, who would have known? What can you do? There's not really much you can do uh, after the fact. This is why the Saturn return for most can be such a difficult time because many souls begin to realize that their life to date, the choices made, have not been in accordance with the underlying intentions. Key, the key word here is opportunity. Even though such an opportunity exists at that time, many souls do not make those choices to adjust their life anyway because of the nature of their existing reality at that time, the structural nature of the reality that has been created to date. For those that don't make the necessary adjustments, the evolutionary intentions will be actualized very slow, minimal way. So he's getting into, if you can make the adjustments, then you can learn. You can get back on your path quickly. If you don't, then your life path intentions will pretty much come to a standstill. He says he has some quotes here that a person might say, if I had only done this or that, or gee, I would really like to be doing that, and so on. These sorts of inner realizations do serve as seed thoughts, desires that will become active at some time in the future for such souls. For the souls who have made the choices earlier in life, prior to the first Saturn return, and the first Saturn return can serve as a timing for actualizing what the soul has been preparing itself for. That's what I was talking about with Jeffrey Green and what happened to him. So many people too. It just kind of dawned on me that they might come to these realizations midway between their first and second Saturn return. Like he's saying here, oh, like if I would have said, say I would just got a normal job or went through with my job and just went through with it all. I didn't become a tennis coach, didn't struggle to quick make some adjustments. Uh, I might start to think about what I want to do in the future. And there we have, like in my area, there's so many people that have to do this. Like we're talking about 30, 35 years of government work, just working at the government. They call it state where I am, they're called state workers. And they're probably all dreaming about what am I going to do next? And then they hit their second Saturn return and they're too old and sick to do it. So then it becomes a dream or a seed desire for the next life. When it could be done right now. It's so sickening actually for most of them. And they just spend their life watching TV. If anybody's watching this, you want to comment in the chat, feel free. I'll try to respond. Let me know what you think of your Saturn return. But yeah, I always really like looking at Saturn returns, you really have to analyze the person's life before you make any real judgments. But I would say somewhere around, it's got to be like at least 20% of people are really suffering right around their Saturn return, and sometimes for the rest of their life because of this phenomenon of not being able to align their life path with what they're doing, not being able to figure it out, living in dream world, not wanting to. Another thing might be, I've seen, like I said about the money, looking at my paycheck, it's like, wow, $450. I think I was making like $30,000 a year. That was my salary. And like I said, I was working hard, but I was used to making like 800 or more. And not really understanding that the people that go through this process, they're like, okay, after 5 years, I'm making 40,000. And then after 10 years, I'm making 60,000. And then you're capped, like that's normal. And then if you want to make more, you have to become a manager or director of some sort. You might have to move. And these are Saturnian things that you can't get around. And a lot of people think they can get around them. Like I had a friend who was she graduated as an attorney. She was making like 70,000, and I'm thinking, wow, she had a nice apartment. I'm thinking you're set up. This is great. She's like, oh, you don't know my bills and this and that. Even when the bills are paid, like the loan, it's still a great salary. It's still a great deal. And then, she's talking about six figures and I should be making 120. This is a person that is going through her Saturn return in her own way. You can see, like, not basically delusional. You could say whatever you wanted. It didn't matter who said it. Even to this day, into her 30s, she probably still thinks this, even though it's been staring her in the face since day one, and she's still making 70-some thousand a year. So that's the resistance. And that's the point that when you don't have experience, you don't have life experience, those things happen. Because you don't, because there's so many. The thing is, there's so many people that too will tell you not to dream, and they'll tell you what their reality is. So you do have to be careful with that. But at the same time, a lot of people can't see where they're delusional, especially around their first Saturn return. I was delusional, for sure. There's so much more to talk about here without anyone saying anything in the chat. I don't know if I can really say anything else without my brain hurting anymore. So I'll leave it a couple more minutes here if anybody wants to make any comments about Saturn return. Thanks for watching and have a good night.